now winter is ending and we're getting into early spring. And this is one of the most critical times for our honeybees. We probably lose more colonies as winter turns into spring than we do all winter long. And this is because we think we know what we're doing, and then our bees run out of food because we've had some weird weather and maybe we didn't leave enough for them. And of course, we just haven't checked on our bees, and so we don't necessarily know what's going on in there. But your queen is already producing brood in January. Some people say that it's the winter solstice, there's the sun cycle that somehow triggers that. I don't know about that, but usually by the middle of January here in Arkansas, queen is going to be laying a little patch of brood, and it gets bigger and bigger. Temperatures sometimes allow for flying. Even if there's snow on the ground, you have a sunny day the next day, you're going to notice bees dead in the snow. You'll also notice little yellow spots in the snow out in front of your hive. That's where they take a cleansing flight and come back. There's probably dead bees on the ground anyway, but you don't notice them when there's dead grass and leaves out there, everything's brown, but you just notice it when there's snow. Bees are dying all winter long and they're falling to the bottom of the hive, and then when they get a warm day, they're carrying the dead out and they drop them in front of the hive. Very unceremonious funeral, but that's what you get when you're a honeybee. But all of this increase in activity and this growing family inside, this requires a lot of food, especially pollen. They need that honey, they need the sugar for energy, but they need pollen for royal jelly in order to raise all that brood. Your winter bees bulk up in the fall. So they actually eat a lot of pollen, and they store the pollen in their bodies in something called a fat body. They have these organs called fat bodies. They don't store fat, they store protein, but then they metabolize that back into royal jelly so that they can feed the brood even before there are any flowers in bloom. So these bees, they require a lot of food, but sometimes we have a really bad cold snap. So we have a late frost, we get all this activity, the colony starts to increase its size again, and suddenly we have 2-3 weeks where it gets really cold. And sometimes we get chilled brood. So the cluster of bees has to shrink up to cover the brood that they can and keep themselves warm and keep the queen warm. And if the brood area was too large, then the larvae at the edge, well, tough luck for them. They're going to freeze to death, and they conserve as much as they can. And so when it warms up again, they pull the dead larvae that have frozen out and they drag them down to the front. And sometimes you'll see something like this and you think, oh no, my bees have a disease. They've got European foul brood or some other condition, and you get worried about your hive. But this is actually the bees' way of conserving as much as they could, and they couldn't save those, and now they're getting rid of them. Sometimes we need to feed our colonies as winter turns into spring. So they have run out of honey, they're all the way at the top of the hive, and we have to provide them with some syrup in order to give them the energy they need to keep going for a few more weeks. But we don't want to feed bees in cold weather down at the entrance to the hive. You want to feed it inside the hive. Where's your cluster of bees? It's going to be high up, right? Individual bees have to go all the way down here to the entrance to feed and go all the way back up. Below about 40 degrees, an individual bee really can't move very far because all insects are cold-blooded. So that individual bee will chill and just stop moving if she gets too cold. But as a group, all of those bees clustered together are generating heat, keeping themselves and each other warm, and that's how they can stay active all winter long. But if we need to feed them food, we want to make sure that it's close to them so that they don't have to go very far to get it. So we want to feed the syrup inside the hive, high up near the cluster if we can. You can use baggy feeders like we talked about. That's a great way to put it right there. If you open the hive and you can see all the bees in a ball right there at the top of the hive, put that food right above them. You can give them a jar feeder right above the hole in your inner cover. You'll have to put another box around it. You can use these other hive top feeders, or you can put a division board feeder in there right next to the cluster, and you'll find that they move over and they'll cluster oftentimes right next to it so they can go down and feed and come back. but you don't want them to have to move very far away. Another thing that you can use is called candy boards. These have been popular up north, but they're kind of catching on down here in the south as well. You can cook down sugar and you can pour it into just a wooden mold. It's just like your inner cover, but there's no hole in the middle, and it makes a big brick of hard candy. And you can put that right on top of the hive. You can just lift the lid up. You see the bees are right there. Just plop it down, and now wherever the bees are, wherever they surface, the ceiling is made of food, and the humidity in the hive will soften that candy, and they'll be able to just come right up and eat it. Some people will also take a pollen patty or a protein supplement, and they'll lay it down and pour the candy on top of it so that as the bees move up, they eat through all the sugar at first, which is what those adult bees need, but then as they start to raise brood, they've eaten through it, and they've got to that artificial pollen, and that gives them a lot of protein that they need. You can make just a brick of it. It doesn't have to be in a mold and cover the whole thing. You can just make a block of candy. Some methods, you cook it down using a candy thermometer. Some people will just wet the sugar down and just pack it into a mold, and it can work just as well. This one, they just put it into a little plastic container and they plopped it down right over that hole in the inner cover so the bees can just come right up and grab it. And you can open up the hive and look without risking any bees getting surprised and coming out that way. So make sure that you have a little space, little wooden spacer there, something, or just a shallow hive body that you can use to provide space that you can put a block of candy here. But this is a good way to feed bees if you find that they really need it. And if you put a candy board on in the fall and your bees, you've got honey and they work their way up and they never get to that candy board, it's not going to spoil. You can take it off, wrap it in plastic, stick it in your freezer, and it's good to go again for next season too. But you can find all kinds of recipes for candy board. They call it fondant candy. There's different names for it, but you can find all kinds of bee candy recipes out there. You can also just feed your bees dry sugar. This is kind of a last resort. You realize that your bees have absolutely no food. You got to feed them in a hurry. You don't have time to cook anything down. Put a sheet of newspaper on top of the brood frames, dump a bunch of sugar on top, spray it down, just spritz it with a little clean water, just kind of soften it up, put the lid back on. Something like that, you could even just turn the inner cover over where it has about a half an inch of space. And that's enough to keep them going for a little while. This is, of course, a much bigger box, but it looks like 10 pounds of sugar in there. Hopefully you don't need to feed them that much. You could just sprinkle some right on the inner cover, and they'll come up through that hole, and it looks like they've chowing down on that. This is one of those division board feeders. Somebody just dumped sugar in that. You could do that too. Again, I would spritz it down with a little bit of water, but you can give them dry sugar in an emergency and then come back later and give them something that's a little more substantial, give them some syrup or something like that. But they can survive on that as long as they've got a little bit of moisture inside the hive. These are things you do not want to feed your bees. Don't feed your bees brown sugar. A lot of people think, oh, organic sugar, that's best for my bees. Sugar in the raw. The reason brown sugar is brown is because it's not pure sugar. There's a lot of undigestible plant material that's mixed in with that cane sugar juice that your bees can't digest. Remember, your bees don't have indoor plumbing. In cold weather, they're stuck inside the hive until they can get out and they can relieve themselves and come back in. But if you're feeding them a lot of stuff they can't digest, then they're going to have a lot more waste build up, and it's going to be very uncomfortable for them, and they may make a mess inside the hive if they can't get out. And sometimes that can mimic a disease called nosema, which we'll learn about later on. Same goes for molasses and things like that. And of course, never give your bees any kind of sugar substitute. And honey here. Why is honey on this list? Never feed your bees strange honey. Store-bought honey. You don't know where that stuff has come from. You don't even know if it's really honey sometimes. If it's your honey or it's from another beekeeper you know and trust, that's fine. But a lot of store-bought honey that comes from overseas especially, it contains spores of a bacterial disease called American foul brood, which we'll learn about later on. But studies have been done on store-bought honey, and it can make all of your bees sick. So don't be giving your bees strange honey. Now, it's okay to eat that honey. It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt your children or anybody else. It's one of those things that only affects honeybees. But you risk killing all your bees if you give them something that contains those spores, and we'll learn more about that later. So avoid giving those things to your bees. If you want to feed your bees sugar, give them plain white refined sugar, because nectar is mostly sucrose. It has other sugars in it too. This is what chemists call a disaccharide. It's got 2 carbon rings in it. And what bees do when they get this sugar, when they get nectar, is they process it by adding an enzyme that chemically breaks this bond right here, and it forms glucose and fructose. Those are the 2 sugars found in honey. So all they're doing is splitting this molecule into 2 halves, and it makes one molecule of water along with it. So when you feed your bees anything else, the sugars don't necessarily go through this process. They don't digest them the same way. So if you're going to feed your bees something, give them the most rudimentary sugar that they need, that their biology needs. Now, we're in a new year with bees, a second springtime with our bees. Right now, there's lots of flowers in bloom. A lot of you guys have ordered bees. You're going to pick them up next weekend. You're going to get going, but my colonies that I overwintered are already twice as big as the bees you're going to buy next week. So they've got a huge advantage of overwintering. All the combs in the hive are already drawn out, so they don't have to do that step. And they've been collecting nectar since the beginning of March. And so I've got honey already coming into my hives. Some of it's already capped off. And so those bees are now going to be on the way to making a big surplus, where your bees are still going to be drawing out combs for a long time. Going into the winter, remember we want brood in the bottom, so there's a cluster there with a lot of food up above it. So as we go through the winter, they move up and they consume that honey as they go, and then in the spring, that cluster is up near the top. That's where the queen is going to be laying eggs, and eventually she works her way down as they fill in more honey there. But if you take the hive apart and you switch those 2 boxes, this is called a spring reversal, now you've put the brood on the bottom and there's empty space above it. So the queen is still down here laying eggs. If we have a cold night, they cluster together, they keep them warm. Again, this is why you might want to close off that screen bottom, because now you've moved the brood down closer to the bottom of the hive. But when they start bringing in nectar, the natural arrangement is to put the nectar above the brood, and so they're going to put that up there. And this encourages them to not store it in the brood nest and make the queen feel crowded, and it doesn't eliminate swarming, but it kind of slows it down so they don't get as crowded as quickly, and so it gives you a little bit more time. This isn't something you have to do. A lot of people don't do it. It's one of those things people argue about. I tend to do it when I get in the hives early in the season. I find the bees are in the top. They've already started laying eggs. There's a whole empty box underneath. I'll switch them. I typically overwinter in 2 deeps. That's what I do, and so I reverse them. If some people overwinter with 1 deep and 1 medium of honey, when you do that, now you've got the medium on the bottom. So that's why I use 2 deeps, but also that's just what I've always done, so I'm just kind of set in my ways, I guess. If you open up your hive and you realize that there's brood in both boxes because they've moved up, there might still be some honey above them, but they've got a little brood nest here and a little brood nest down there, you do not want to switch them, because now you've broken it up, and now if you have a cold snap, the workers have to choose which bees live and which ones die, and they'll go wherever the queen is. And if she wound up down here, then a lot of them up there, they may not make it. Or both halves might die, because you've got bees trying to cover both halves of that. So if you find it in the middle, just leave them as it is. The spring build-up period, though, when the flowers start blooming, this is when it really takes off. You know what that flower is? Anybody? Maple. Well, you know what you're talking about. You've been keeping bees. That's a very important plant in Arkansas. That is one of the primary pollen sources for bees early in the spring. We don't look at a maple tree and say, "Oh, what beautiful big blossoms." But to a bee, that is a fabulous buffet. It's one of the only things in bloom when it comes out. And we don't really look at them as being showy, but there's a lot of nutrients in there. There's nectar in there too, but there's a lot of pollen. This is pussy willow. Willows, elms, ash trees, and maples are really good for early season pollen. Holly also has flowers. If you look around outside right now, holly is in bloom. It has been for a couple of weeks. And your hedges will be buzzing. I had a lady call me last week. She thought she had a swarm, and after I talked to her for a little while, I realized she probably just had holly bushes that were in bloom. So I told her to go look, and she called me back later and she said, "You were right. There's little tiny flowers all over it, and there's bees all over it." But holly produces a ton of pollen and nectar that bees love. You don't see a lot of great big flowers. They're itty bitty, but they're there. It's one of the few plants that has the fruit on it while it's flowering the next year. Of course, your apples, crab apples, things like that, wild plums are coming out, and those are good. They bloom briefly, but they produce a lot when they do. Little things like crocus and ground cover comes up. Things that we consider weeds, dandelion, henbit, things like that, but to a bee, that's all good stuff. So avoid mowing your lawn for a couple more weeks, right? When your spouse says, "You need to get out there and mow," say, "I can't, my bees need that." They need those dandelions. And then the clover starts blooming, so you've got another excuse. "Well, I can't mow down the clover now." The more pollen that comes in, the more they store it away, but they're also ingesting it. They're turning it into royal jelly. They're feeding it to the queen. The more the queen eats, the higher protein diet she gets, the more eggs she produces. Well, the more eggs she can produce, the more larvae we have. Then the larvae need royal jelly, and they need bee bread, and so the bees have to go out and get more pollen and bring it in for all these little mouths they have to feed, and the whole cycle ramps up. And you have this exponential growth inside the colony this time of year. Pretty soon they're capping the brood, and then you've got more bees emerging. Ideally, in a perfect comb, you see the queen has this nice round pattern. Well, she starts laying eggs in the middle and kind of spirals around to the outside, and then she'll go around to the other side of the comb and do it again, and step over to the next comb and do it again. So when the brood is mature, you start to see an empty patch that gets wider and wider because the oldest brood is in the middle, and that patch gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it'll look like this, and then it'll all hatch out. There's always some stragglers, but they clean up all those empty cells, get them ready for the queen to come back and start laying eggs in again, and it starts all over. Sometimes you see weird patterns, but typically this is what we kind of like to see. So look for capped brood, look for open brood. You want to see all different colors of pollen, bee bread in there. You want to be able to see nectar cells that are open. You want to start seeing capped honey. Worker brood, you need to be able to tell the difference between workers and drones at this point. How much drone brood is there? That's an important thing to notice early in the season because drones are the harbingers of swarm season. When you start to see drones, you know that you're going to start seeing swarm cells pretty soon on these overwintered colonies because the drones have to be mature reproductive age before they can successfully mate with a queen, and the bees know that, and so they won't start making new queens until they know there's pretty sure that there's going to be plenty of drones out there for these new queens to mate with. Otherwise, they won't be good queens. Some beekeepers like these pollen patties or protein patties. There's not really any real pollen in them. They're made out of a bunch of different stuff, soy protein, egg protein, all kinds of stuff. You can trap pollen in a pollen trap and feed it back to your bees later if you want, but this is what's commercially available. And you can give it to your bees and really jumpstart brood production early on if you want to. If you were going to be producing nukes for sale, or you had pollination contracts with farmers and you needed lots of bees to go do that, or you plan to make some splits, then maybe you want to really jumpstart that brood production. But if you're just a casual backyard beekeeper, you probably don't necessarily need to worry about that. And if you're feeding your bees a lot of protein that they're not eating, something else will. Small hive beetles love pollen patties. So instead of feeding that whole thing, you might break it up into a half or even a quarter of a piece, give it to your bees, make sure that they're eating it. Because if you look in there and you find all these little wormy beetle grubs in there, scoop it all out, put it in a plastic bag, tie it off, freeze it, hit it with a hammer, step on it a couple times, show those grubs that you hate them, and then throw it away. Don't just scoop it out and throw it on the ground because they'll be back. They'll finish eating it and they'll pupate, go in the soil, and come right back out. If you start producing extra brood in the spring, then you're going to jumpstart swarm season too. So if you're not ready for that, look out. When you start making extra bees, they're going to do something about it. And if you're not paying attention, they're going to fly away and they're going to leave you. This is a chart from a book that I copied out of here that kind of shows the swarm season in different areas. In South Louisiana, I think most of this data comes from Baton Rouge area. You can see that swarm season starts beginning of March. In Arkansas, it goes a little later, April to June. In Pennsylvania, it starts in late May. It's more in June, and there's some more in later in the year. And this is in New York State, where it happens later. But you notice there's two swarm seasons up north. That's because those northern states get that late fall or mid-fall nectar flow. Bees think it's like another spring. There's so many flowers in bloom, and they really build up again, and they'll take off and start to swarm. But if you're a bee who starts to swarm in October in Pennsylvania, chances of you finding a hollow tree, moving in, building all the comb, and then collecting all the food you need to survive a cold winter up there, it's pretty slim. If a beekeeper catches you and puts you in a hive with drawn comb and gives you gallons of syrup, you might make it, but otherwise you probably aren't. And we still sometimes see late swarms here, but most of them are early on. And if you look at those dates, that coincides with the honey flow here. Bees are taking advantage of all that available food to move out, start a new colony, and then still store up all the food they're going to need for next winter in about a 2-month period. So they're busy doing that. And so this is the time of the year that we get all of our calls about swarms. This is the time of year that you should be ready to capture those before they fly away. Swarming is normal, it's natural. This is just how the species survives. This is how colonies reproduce. This ensures that there will always be more honeybees out there for us. And beekeepers love capturing swarms when they belong to other people. Free bees, when they're your bees and I catch them, but when they're my bees and they fly out, now I gotta go climb a tree. I don't wanna do that. I got to drive 6 miles, and when I get there, the lady who called me says, "Oh, they just flew away. I was about to call you." It always happens too. Every beekeeper should try to catch some swarms, so every beekeeper has some great swarm stories. And if we passed around the microphone, we'd hear all kinds of crazy stuff. But if you've got a good, productive queen in a healthy hive, it's going to get crowded. Bees are already swarming out there. So if you want to be on the swarm list, then let me know, and maybe you'll get lucky. It's kind of a lottery. But they produce new queens, and they're rearing those in those special cells. So inside this hive, the queen takes off. She leaves with about 1/2 to 2/3 of the workers, and then they cluster together, and your neighbors are terrified, and they call the fire department, they call the exterminator. Those bees fly off, and they find a hollow tree, or they find where the trim on the side of your neighbor's houses fell down, and they say, "Ooh, look at that cavity in there," and they move right in. And now, you won't want to, but you're going to feel morally obligated to go help your neighbor because they know those bees came out of your yard, so now you have to spend a Saturday up on a ladder removing their siding.
They think they're yours anyway.
They'll think that they're your bees even if they came from the other direction, that's right. Meanwhile, back inside your hive, a new queen emerges. She goes off and takes her nuptial flights, comes back from her honeymoon, and she inherits a colony ready to go. So it's full of food, it's full of brood. She just steps right up and she's the new queen. So when you see drones, remember that you're going to start seeing swarm cells pretty soon. If you don't look for those, you might see this. But chances are you're going to miss it because this is only there for a few minutes. It comes out of the hive, and within an hour, they've already settled. Actually, it's right there. You can't see it too well in this picture, but if it was brighter, you could. So they're all going to settle down up there. And try putting a ladder up against that flimsy little limb, right? If you're lucky, you can find them all put together like that. You can just snip that branch, and they all stay together. And as long as you're careful, you can carry that right away, and you can set that gently down into another hive. If you've got a lot of style like this guy, he caught the queen bee, and he's got it in his hand, and he's just walking down the sidewalk. This is in the Dominican Republic, and he's just casual. He needs a soundtrack, don't you think? Just walking down the street, and he'll come back home, and he'll just drop it in the hive, and he'll just shake them all in, and he'll have all of those bees. You can find anything on the internet, right? But honeybees are not aggressive, especially swarms. A brand new swarm is unlikely to sting. Unlikely to sting. A brand new swarm has nothing to protect. The last thing they do before they leave the hive is fill their honey crop with honey. They've packed their lunch boxes, which is inside, and so they're in a good mood. They've got no brood, they've got no home to protect. They really just want to be left alone, but you really can walk up and shake hands with one as long as you're gentle. I don't necessarily recommend it. Somebody's going to try it, they're going to say, that John the bee guy said I could do this, and you're going to find out that those bees didn't like it, but I take no responsibility once you leave this room. But if you find something like that hanging out, you can just simply walk up, say, I told you to save your little nuke boxes, didn't I? And this is why. You just walk right up underneath it. You can snip that branch, or you can just shake them, and most of them will drop right in there, and you close the lid, and there you go. You got $150 worth of bees. Sometimes, it seems like all the calls I get are these. They're way up in the tree. Now, when somebody calls you, you ask a couple of questions. How high are they? How long have they been there? And have you tried to kill them yet? Oh no, I would never hurt a honeybee. Oh, they're about 6 feet off the ground. I just saw them. You get over there and there's 20 feet up in the air. There's an empty can of bug spray under the hedge. And they've been there for 4 days and they're starting to get into a bad mood. But you can still try to rescue them if you want. Usually the ones that are like this, that's when I look at my list and I say, I'm going to call this guy. Yeah. Freebies, you want those? That's all for you. I'm more interested in this one. Yeah, but sometimes they end up on a wall. This guy's trying to sweep them into a round bucket off of a flat surface. Use a square cardboard box for that. And if they're laid out on a wall, chances are you can spot the queen if you just look. And if you can grab that queen, you can put her in a cage. It requires some dexterity. You can't be afraid, but you can do it gently. Put her in a cage, put her in a box. The rest of them will just march right in after her. Just takes a little bit of time. These can get tricky. What do you do with that? You stand on one side of the fence with an empty box, and you have a buddy on the other side with the lid to that box, and have him just gently press all the bees through, and when they're all on your side of the fence, then you just brush them all straight down in a box and put the lid back on. Sometimes, though, they wind up in places they shouldn't. You will be amazed at how quickly they can build a comb. One of my wife's friends had bees move into her house. She swears they were only there for a day. She saw them land. She called me the same day. Probably within 6 hours I got over there, and I looked and I cut into the wall. They had already built a honeycomb the size of my hand in 6 hours. So you leave them in there a couple of years, they can really go. All you need is a spigot on the inside, right? Hot water, cold water, and honey on tap. It doesn't quite work out like that, though, does it? Once they move inside a wall, it's more of an advanced technique to get rid of them. These are bee vacs, so it's a shop vac, and there's a beehive or some box, and you can suck the bees in, and there's something that keeps them from going into the vacuum itself. And if you construct them right, you can put a couple of combs in there. The bees have something to land on. And you use very low suction when you suck them up. But you can collect all the bees, and you have to cut each comb off, and you have to scrape all the beeswax out of that cavity, fill it in again with insulation or foam or something, so that there's no void that smells like beeswax, so that bees get back in there. But there's a lot of liability when you start opening up somebody else's walls. There's pipes, there's wires, you're up on a ladder. You don't want to fall off of that into somebody's driveway. If you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, good luck. There's a reason that people charge a lot of money for bee removals. In Arkansas, though, you can't charge money for bee removal unless you have a pest control license, because you are doing a service, a professional service, removing what's considered a pest by non-beekeepers. And if you're going to do that for money, you have to have a license to do it, and you have to be bonded and insured. So if you want to learn more about that, you can ask me, but you'll have to go over to the plant board to get that license. But sometimes you do get a call for the perfect swarm. It's low down, it's easy to get, it's huge. You could just saw right through that nice limb in that person's apple orchard, but they probably wouldn't like that. But just get as close as you can with a hive, give it a good hard shake, and knock them right down into a hive, close it up. If you can leave that hive there until sunset, chances are if you've got the queen, they're all going to go inside there and you can move them away. This was a call I got one time. An exterminator called me because a gentleman had called the exterminator. He was having his house checked for termites, and then he saw this swarm and he said, and get those bugs there while you're at it. And he knew what they were, so he called me and I came over and I poked around in there, and it was a nice swarm. And I didn't have any equipment on me because I was out when I got the call, but I had a cardboard box, so I just snipped that limb and I laid it down gently, and I looked up and the guy was inside his living room against the window like, because I wasn't wearing a bee suit or anything. He couldn't believe anybody would do that, and I took him home and gave him to my wife as a gift. Swarm prevention. It's better to prevent a swarm than to have to go climb a tree or drive 10 miles and find out, oh, they just left, or all the other things. So, of course, preventing swarms is easier said than done. This is one of the most challenging parts of keeping bees because swarms are based on some very strong urges in the animal kingdom. It's like trying to teach teenagers to stay out of the back seat of the car. You know, there's a strong reproductive urge going on here. So you want to make sure they've got plenty of space during that build-up period. You can reverse those hive bodies. It doesn't stop it, but it does help to slow down that process a little. You can add another super on top. If you've only got one box and they're getting crowded, add a second story or add a honey super on so that they're not filling in the brood area with honey. You can break up the brood combs. So if your brood nest is very compact and you add another box, take a few combs and move them up and put empty combs in the middle, so as the queen goes back and forth, she encounters a lot of empty space. She doesn't feel crowded. If you do see queen cells, you can remove them, but that's not going to last very long. That's very temporary. They've already decided they're going to swarm, they're going to rebuild them, usually, and they're going to do it fairly quickly, so keep an eye on them. Before you cut out queen cells, make sure there is a queen in that hive, because sometimes they swarmed yesterday. It was such a huge hive, such a huge colony, so many bees, you didn't even notice that 30,000 of them left. There's still so many bees in there, and you see all those swarm cells and you think, well, they couldn't have possibly swarmed because there's so many bees. I'll just cut all of those out. Well, now you've doomed the colony because they can't make any more. You can use those cells, though. You can requeen another hive. You can very carefully cut them out, or you can take the whole frame and you can put it into another hive. You can give them to another beekeeper who needs them, or you can make a split. A split is just an artificial swarm. Think about what the bees want to do. The queen's leaving and taking more than half the bees with her and starting a new colony, and everybody else stays back home. Well, you can take the queen and a bunch of bees and move them into another box on your terms without having to climb a tree to get them. And you can force them to do that thing they already want to do in the box where you want them. And it usually works if you do it right. So you've got a big colony. It doesn't even have to be a humongous whopper like that. Just a couple of deeps. You can start a little 5-frame nuke over to the side. Just take the comb out that has the queen on it. You got to find that queen, move her to a new hive. Now, give her a frame of honey, give her a frame of pollen, give her a couple of frames that are half pollen, half honey. You know, just make sure that she's got a good amount of each. Give her a frame with open brood. Now the frame she's on, she might be laying, it's got eggs, it's got open brood, that one will work. Put that in there because when there's open brood, then the nurse bees, their natural babysitting instincts will kick in. They don't want to abandon open brood, so they're not going to leave those hungry little larvae in there. And I like to give them a couple of frames of capped brood, because capped brood doesn't need to be tended, but it's going to hatch out in the new hive over here, and it's going to populate it with young bees that are going to be nurse bees that are going to help really establish that colony. But they don't need to be fed or tended, and when they hatch out, they're never going to know that they were eggs in this hive and they got moved. They're going to think they belong over there. Fill in extra spaces with frames of foundation or combs, and then I like to shake in extra bees. So go back to your original hive, find frames of open brood, pick them up very gently, covered with bees because your open brood is covered with nurse bees. Now hold it over your little hive, your split, and take your bee brush and just brush them all into that hive and put the comb back. Do that 2 or 3 times because now you've moved a lot of nurse bees, young nurse bees over here. The nurse bees don't really go outside, so once they drop in here, they're going to stay put. Plus, you've got some open brood in there, so they'll tend to those. Now, when the sun comes up the next day, all your older bees are going to fly out to forage. And when they come back, they're going to return to this hive because they always have. They've oriented on that location. So you lose your older bees, but the young ones stay with the queen. They stay with the brood. And so this colony over here will be okay. You don't have to put it right here next to it. You can move it farther away. You can put it anywhere else in your bee yard you want. You can even take it to a completely different bee yard and set it up there. But as long as you've moved the queen over here, you've left queen cells, or you've given them brood or eggs, they can raise their own queen. These bees will be busy rearing that queen, and they're going to be okay too. You're going to, if you don't know where the queen is, you can make a split and just move brood and eggs and food and everything into a new hive and just leave it. Some people call that a walk-away split. Just evenly divide all the food, evenly divide all the capped brood, evenly divide all the open brood into 2 different boxes. Now the queen's in one box or the other. Which one is it? It doesn't matter. Unless there's queen cells. If you left queen cells in both sides, the one with the queen is still going to swarm. But if they're not making queen cells, one half is going to have a queen. Now there's a much smaller population. They may not swarm, they might still. The other one is going to raise more queens from the brood that they have. So there's different ways to do it, but this is kind of what I like to do. I like to move the queen because this way the bees in this hive think, well, we were planning to swarm, we made all these queen cells and everybody left, so I guess I wasn't paying attention when they did, but oh well, we'll just raise these queens here. Now, the ones over here, the queen says, I don't remember swarming, but this is all new and I've got plenty of room, so we must have, and that kind of removes that urge to swarm from them, so it usually works. You can leave the queen here and you can make splits, and you can sometimes do it 2 or 3 times if you've got a really good queen who's constantly making brood and making queen cells over there. So if you wanted to make a whole bunch of little splits, you could do it that way too. But the cat brood helps to populate that side, plus there's cat brood over here that's going to continue to emerge and keep the population going here while they raise a new queen. Do this early in the season after you've seen adult drones, and usually this will work out pretty well. And it can prevent swarming. Doesn't mean it will, but it can. And it's a lot better than having your bees move out into your neighbor's soffits or otherwise just losing them completely. So this honey flow is a very short time a year. It's, in Arkansas, it's really just a couple of months, maybe 2.5 months. If you're really lucky, we can have 3 months of really good weather, but they're going to get almost all of the honey for next winter in this short period of time. And remember, we're going to do a little math here. It takes 21 days for a worker to go from egg to adult. But even after they emerge as an adult, it takes another 3.5 weeks for them to do all the different jobs that they do and become a foraging bee. So if you want to maximize honey production in your hives, then you got to ensure that you've got a good queen and a strong foraging force. So brood production has to be really strong for 45 days prior to when the honey flow starts. So we say honey flow starts about mid-April here. May 15th, you pay your taxes and then the honey starts rolling in. It's a good day for everybody, right? That means you go back a month and a half to March 1st. You need a good queen laying eggs. You need good weather, good flying weather, lots of pollen coming in the hive, and you have to keep your colony from swarming through all of this time so that when the honey flow starts, you've got the maximum number of bees in the hive that are at the right age to go out and gather more food. You get more honey from one large hive full of bees than you do from 2 hives that are smaller, the same total number of bees, but they're divided up into 2 hives because you're going to need a certain number of bees as nurse bees for each queen. But if they're all in one hive, you got one queen, she's got a certain number of nurse bees, all the rest can go off on foraging duties. So you'll actually get more honey if you can keep them all in one massive hive, but that's a lot more difficult to do than to divide them up into smaller hives.